Good afternoon. Are y'all enjoying Paleo Effects so far? Good. Please don't forget to use your hashtag PFX15. This man needs no introduction. He is he's a guru to a lot of people. He hates that word, but it's true. Lots of us really look up to him, and he's changed a lot of lives. He is the best-selling author, New York Times best-selling author of The Paleo Solution. Please welcome to the stage, Robb.
Thank you. Thanks. How's everybody doing? So this is my first time doing this talk, and it's a pretty broad departure from what I've done in the past. Protein, carbs, fat have definitely been my mainstay for a long time, but I was the main paper I'm going to reference in this thing I'll show you at the end, but it was about 9 months ago, even before my daughter was born, and I read this paper and it was just kind of mind-blowing. How many people had followed my podcast when I had the Your Brain on Porn guy on? A few people, and like, he's amazing. Gary, I think is his name. And what he put forward was this idea that novelty was this driver that is really important for humanity, but in certain situations, and in that situation, not the situation we're talking about today, porn, people could actually expose themselves to a level of novelty, a level of stimulus that was dopamine secreting in the brain to such a degree that people literally became non-functional. And it just kind of got me thinking, got me ruminating, and you know, when we talk about food and we're trying to help people, it's very challenging because we're trying to figure out heuristics that we can share with folks, simple stories that can get them moving forward and improve their lives. And what I find is that when people are stymied in some progress that they're attempting to embark upon, one of the first things that pops up in this sense of failure is this moral failure. That's where the failure goes, you know, sloth and laziness and gluttony. And I find that it's incredibly hurtful, and it creates a psychic logjam that's almost impossible to undo. Once the person has gone to that point of failure, so that there's like religious questions and existential questions about what they are up to and why they haven't been able to be successful, let's say with just losing weight or sticking to an exercise program, that person is lost, and it's really tragic, particularly when you look at some of the things I'm going to share with you today. Some of the ideas that I want to share with you is that the forces that made us who we are just very poorly matched for the environment that we live in today. And this is nothing new for you guys. I mean, if you paid the money to show up here, you're deep enough into the Paleo Nerd Fest that you get this stuff. But you know, for me, this was looking at the behavioral change elements of this story was really a reawakening for me. It stepped beyond protein, carb, fat in a way that's been very refreshing. For me to understand this topic, there's kind of two intersecting concepts, and the two of those are this idea of an opportunistic omnivore, and within that opportunistic omnivore is optimum foraging strategy. How many people have heard of optimum foraging strategy? Okay, a lot of people, so great. Hopefully this makes good sense to you. It's made pretty good sense to me. Again, I haven't shared this with really anyone yet, so I don't know if this thing is going to be one of the best talks I've ever done or complete fart in church, so I don't know. But within optimum foraging strategy, there's this very simple idea that you try to get as much nutrition doing as little as you possibly can. And every organism that creeps and crawls on the planet does this same strategy. Unless you live in the high energy availability world that we live in today, no other organism can run around willy-nilly burning lots of energy because the returns on the nutrition available in its environment will not keep it alive. So virtually all organisms have figured out some sort of work-rest pacing so that they do as little as possible to get as much nutrition as possible. But it hasn't been working out so well for us. Yeah, who remembers that movie? Airplane, yeah, one of my favorite movies. So just a couple of statistics. You guys are you know, I don't want to bury you with some of this stuff, but 108 million people in the US every year try a diet. Most of them give it up. Most of them attempt 4 to 5 times to do that diet. Most of them fail. Another interesting one, when I was digging up statistics, 220 morbidly obese people in the United States in 2009 had a gastric bypass surgery. Cost with those is an average of $15,000 to $35,000. This wiring that we have, this tendency to seek out as much food as we can get while doing as little as we can, is basically driving this obesity curve. We have just now kind of, at this outer edge, it's kind of flattened out. This has been an exponential growth curve, but in the last maybe 4 or 5 years, it's kind of flattened out. But we have some really serious problems that are growing out of that obesity. Type 2 diabetes being one of the primary issues. We now know about neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is considered type 3 diabetes, diabetes of the brain. All of these things are related back to an energy excess that typically is, driven by our diet, and theoretically we have tight control over, but clearly we don't. Most of us know better than to do this stuff, but we continue to do this stuff. Even if we have some control on this, we don't have to go far to find friends or family that are deeply affected by this process. And you got to ask why. Why is this stuff going on? Why is this occurring? Why are we broken in this way? Or is it that we're really broken? I don't think that we're broken. I think that we're living exactly the way that we should be. It's just we've had strategies that were highly adaptive in the past, and they're completely maladaptive today. So in our attempt to answer these questions, why, we've had some simple heuristics that have popped up. Everybody's heard that carbohydrates are the driver of diabetes and overweight, right? Show of hands. We've all heard this stuff. It's very compelling. There's some very interesting elements to it. Stefan Guyenet, this is a slide from Stefan Guyenet. I think he really puts that notion to bed. We haven't really seen an increase in carbohydrate consumption specifically over the course of time. A more compelling theory is that we consume more calories overall. And again, Stefan Guyenet has made the point that we do consume more calories. This is an interesting graph. This doesn't show necessarily that we consume more calories, but there are just more calories available in the environment that we exist in than ever before. So, pretty good argument that we're consuming more calories, but even that we eat too much or we eat too many calories really is an unsatisfying answer for me. How many people follow Jeff Leach's work at the Human Gut Project? Show of hands out there. This is an amazing website and really interesting mapping of the human genome. But Jeff Leach had a great post in addition to one thing that I'll share with you, but in this one blog update, Jeff ended up doing a field fecal transplant from a Hadza guy. The guy pooped in a milkshake container, and Jeff blended it up and put it into a turkey baster and upended himself and did a fecal transplant in the field, and pretty amazing. And in addition to those, rarefied talents, he also made the observation that the Hadza live in complete food abundance. They are rich with food, rich with calories, but it's of a particular type and a particular quality of calories. They don't have refined food, and there is work involved with all the food that they obtain. There's periods of the year where they, I believe, adult Hadzas eat upwards of 3 to 4 pounds of honey a day, which seems like a lot, and it is a lot, but if you crack into a beehive and get stung by Africanized bees, then you probably deserve to eat 3 or 4 pounds of honey after that because you got the shit stung out of you. So, it's a very different story, and so this is a paper I've referenced in some of the other panels. Comparison of ancestral diets suggests dense acellular carbohydrate promotes an inflammatory microbiota. I really think this is possibly the most important paper in all of this ancestral health scene. Cannot recommend it enough. It's technical, but it's also very accessible, and it really makes the point that when we refine carbohydrate, that alters the gut biome. Altering the gut biome then leads to metabolic changes that can be pro-inflammatory, and on and on and on. And then there are other elements to this story that pertain to highly refined foods being hyper-palatable, which I'll get to in a little bit, but I just really need to make the point that it's not morality. We are not morally broken because we overeat. It's not laziness. What it definitely is novelty. We live in a hyper-novel environment that we are very, very poorly equipped to, and I'm going to make an interesting, possibly interesting point here in a minute about that. But the average American supermarket has over 50,000 new food items, or 50,000 items a year that are stocked on the shelves, 11,000 new items a year. If you like salty and crunchy, there will be new salty and crunchy items. If you like sweet and sour, there'll be new sweet and sour items. If you've just followed the progression of some of the larger, somewhat peripheral fast food chains, you know, McDonald's now has like Tex-Mex options, you know, so these blendings of foods and flavors and textures. So there's something for every palate, and I would argue that these things are really superseding our ability for any type of self-control. So if we understand who we come from, or where we come from, we can understand who we are and maybe make some informed decisions about what to do. This paper that I'll give you guys the reference for this at the end, it makes this point. A biocultural approach considers the interplay between biology, culture, and evolution. So on the one hand, on the base, we have biology, the process of life. The process of life and evolution led to an organism or organisms preceding us that were able to develop culture. Culture is language and sharing and knowledge and farming and technology and all these different things. And it's interesting, as culture developed, it actually has also driven our evolution, both for the good and potentially the bad. So this may sound a little crazy, but I'm going to make the argument that if you are fat, sick, and broken, you are a success story. You have done nothing wrong. You've done everything right. I would actually argue that if you're living in this environment and you are not fat, sick, and broken, that you have done something drastically at odds with the genetics that got us here today. Is that kind of crazy? But I think in some ways it's true. Now, clearly there are ramifications to that, and I just love that. But if we understand, and you know, there's lots of coaches, lots of practitioners here. If we're facing someone that is just log-jammed with this process of change, and there's this like moral self-loathing going on, I think that this is a really liberating thing to experience. This notion that you're not broken, you're not slothful, you're not lazy. You being overweight is exactly the most appropriate thing that you could ever do, considering the genetics that we are born with. You are completely liberated. You are Thelma and Louise launching that car off the cliff. Yeehaw, you've done it all right. But if we want our lives to be different, we still have to do something different. And this is why I said that I thought that this might be the best talk I've ever given, or this might be the last time that Paleo FX doesn't put up a do not serve sign for me. For me, it was very, very compelling, you know, this understanding that struggling with this process is completely natural, that there's something innately in us that makes our current environment very, very difficult to navigate. But if we want, and I think on the one hand, if people want the Thelma and Louise experience, which I had an interesting example of this. Years ago, I went on a cruise, which was a very odd experience in and of itself, but there was an older couple on the cruise that were both type 2 diabetic, and what they had done is sold their house, liquidated their retirement, and they were booked for continuous cruises around the world until they died. And they were basically on the food death cruise, which I think is kind of the Thelma and Louise deal. You know, and those people, fully eyes open, were embracing what they were doing. They loved to eat. They fell in love together eating, and they were going to die eating together. And okay, that's odd, but fine. You know, you can make that choice. But all too often, I think that a lot of people end up in this situation, and they really want to do something different. And I think that we need to have an understanding to be able to go somewhere. But I'll throw this caveat out here at the front, and I would be very interested for feedback about this. The parts of the brain that drive this whole process are deeply embedded within us. It's the deeper, more primitive areas of the brain that drive attractiveness and sexual drive and interest in food, and it largely supersedes our cognitive forebrain. And what I'm presenting is a cognitive solution. It's a thinking solution, not an emotive solution, other than if we can lift the guilt that we feel with struggle. I think that the guilt that we feel when we struggle could be a major impediment to this process, but I don't know if that's enough to then jackhammer this idea from the forebrain down into our reptilian hindbrain and free us from this whole process. But you know, if we understand that evolution and culture are some commingling elements, then I think that this can help us remove some of the guilt that we've experienced with struggle in our modern world. So I'm going to share what may be a little bit of a wacky example here, and it's the natural history of sickle cell anemia and how that has shaped some of the human biome. So the Swidden culture in Africa was one of the earliest areas to develop some form of agriculture. And what these folks would do is come into these jungle areas, use slash and burn technology to burn the vegetation. And if you see these areas, that kind of white is actually ash, but that's a perfect environment for this wet, rainy area to collect shallow areas of water, which is the perfect environment for the Anopheles mosquito to live in. Now, humans in this area have always struggled with a certain degree of malarial load. Malaria is carried by the Anopheles mosquito. But when we started slash and burn technology, this provided the environment that these Anopheles mosquitoes thrive in. And then we started living in concentrated, high population areas with thatched roofs that provided amazing ecological surface for these mosquitoes to live in. And malaria became an enormous problem. The most severe forms of malaria can have a 20% mortality rate. There's lots of associated morbidity, mortality with malaria. It's a very large problem. If you've ever traveled to malaria-infected areas, you have to take anti-malarial drugs, and those are pretty nasty. So there was an enormous selection pressure in humans to figure out a way to deal with malaria. One of those ways of dealing with this ultimately manifests in a disease called sickle cell anemia. And it's a very simple change. You change one glutamate amino acid for a valine amino acid. It's a one base pair change. And what this does is, under low oxygen situations, the red blood cells that would normally fold, next slide, that when they go through the capillaries, they can fold and squish and move through these small areas. For a sickle cell anemia individual, the cells don't really fold, they clot together and clump. And the sickle cell homozygous carrier, the person in red, that person is most likely going to die before reproductive age. And that's interesting from an evolutionary biology perspective. Usually, if you institute some sort of a genetic change that the individual dies before reproductive age, that's a negative feedback loop. But it so powerfully benefits the heterozygous carriers, the two folks in the middle. People who are heterozygous for sickle cell anemia, they are quite resistant to malaria. And so those folks tend to live. Out of 4 offspring, the one unaffected person is just at the luck of the draw, because you know, they may get malaria, they may not. One person homozygous, they're probably going to die before reproductive age. But these two folks in the middle, being heterozygous, they're actually immunized against malaria. So interestingly, malaria caused the most rapid genetic changes in human history. It is not a benign change. 1 out of 4 of those kids is most likely going to die before reproductive age, but ultimately the net benefit is worth it, although it's a fascinating story and a very high cost. So Why don't we vilify people for sickle cell anemia? Why don't we stomp around and be like, why are you resistant? Why don't you just die, you know? And we don't do that, clearly. It's ridiculous, but sickle cell anemia is a survival advantage. It's absolutely no different than the propensity to approach a novel diet. If you vilify somebody for enjoying novelty in their diet, novelty in their life, then you are vilifying them for exactly the same things that allow people with sickle cell anemia traits to survive. It's a survival advantage, or at least it was up until our modern ubiquitous food system. So novelty was a key to our survival, and I apologize, I'm gonna share some slides that I'm basically going to read from. I wanted to do some excerpts from these slides, but this paper is just so well written that I'm going to read to you guys, and I apologize for that. I usually try not to do that with talks, but novelty is key to our survival. The strategy of Paleolithic foragers was to eat small amounts of various foods that decrease the impact of toxins or poisons and pathogens. This is part of optimum foraging strategy, and it's part of this process that we'll talk about in a little bit called palate fatigue. When we get exposed to a particular type of food, even if it's a very, very good food, our palate will fatigue in exposure to that food, and it will push us on to another type of food. And what that did in the past is that it diversified the nutrients that we got, but more importantly, it diversified the toxicants that we were exposed to. And that's something that's just woven into our DNA. It's woven into our brain circuitry to approach life and eating in that way. Eating a variety of foods makes it more likely that the species will get a balanced diet that includes the required micronutrients and simultaneously limits the amount of toxin ingested. So this weaves into this whole idea of optimum foraging strategy, that there's an interplay, a cost-benefit analysis associated with getting enough novelty. But then there's another side to this, which I'll talk about, neophobia, the phobia of new food here in just a little bit, that there is also the possibility that you eat something new and you die. So somebody ate a pufferfish once and that guy died, and then somehow people kept fiddling with it, and now we have sushi chefs that prepare pufferfish, and after you sign a waiver, then you get to eat it and maybe die or maybe not. But you know, there's huge risk reward involved with that. Every time we as a species were exposed to a new food, potentially that food could have been a huge boon, or it could have been our death. And so woven into us is this somewhat reticence. On the one hand, we want novelty. On the other hand, new things can be a little bit scary, and we're a little bit suspicious of checking it out. And boredom is just baked into the cake. Palate fatigue, sensory-specific satiety, and monotony assured the consumption of a varied diet. And so I'll share with you some of the macronutrients of some modern hunter-gatherers. And these people live in relative abundance, but yet they will burn out on a particular food, and that food will be right outside their front door, but they will move miles over the landscape to get a novel type of food, which actually, interestingly, kind of flies in the face of optimum foraging strategy. But there's a trade-off between this and an interplay. On the one hand, we have optimum foraging strategy, eat as much as you can while doing as little as you can. The other piece to this is a potent drive for novel foods and as palatable of foods as we can get. And if you're into game theory, there's some interesting stuff that kind of looks into that. So one thing to take away on a practical standpoint is it's very, very difficult to overeat simple meals. And early in my coaching with folks, I had, and if you read my book, do you remember the gal Lisa that you know, on board? Do a couple of folks remember that? Yeah. I don't know if you know the story, but you know, usually when you tell stories about folks in a written volume, like what I did with my book, you change the name. And so I put her name as Lisa in the book, but her name was really Lisa because I never expected her to ever come back to our gym, and she actually did. So, and she read the book and she's like, "Is that me?" And I'm like, "It might be you." So, so my answer to boredom for folks is this idea of the food matrix. We've got 27 proteins, 24 vegetables, 5 fats, 25 herbs and spices. I forget, there's like 85,000 meal options here or something. It's like if you ate one meal, if you did chicken breast, asparagus, coconut oil, allspice, chicken breast, asparagus, coconut oil, basil, and just work your way through this whole matrix, it's like 210 years of different meals. So this was an attempt on my part, unbeknownst at the time. I wanted to introduce variety to folks so that they weren't burned out and they could stick with the program, but it was just enough variety. And it was variety within the context of good foods, but not hyper-palatable foods. And it's helped a lot of people, and I think works pretty well. From this paper, they break down some of the components of cuisine, which is really, really interesting when we look at it from a cultural and an evolutionary perspective. The first component of cuisine is that foods are selected from the environment. This is based on optimum foraging strategy, and it argues that the organism will select nutrients that give it the greatest benefit for the least energy expended. So again, that's this optimum foraging strategy idea, but it's juxtaposed against this desire for novelty and palate fatigue. So we have kind of two counter elements that are fighting back and forth. So we're genetically wired to get as much variety as possible, doing as little as possible, but also with that caveat that we really like novelty as well. Second component of cuisine is that we tend to process foods, makes them easier to digest, smoking, salting, milling, different cooking techniques. Third component of cuisine is that we add flavors to minimize the boredom component. That really harkens back to my food matrix story. So we use a variety of spices in particular that are, interestingly, the most nutrient-dense foods that we can get. Herbs and spices and organ meats are just about neck and neck for the most vitamins, minerals, and antioxidants you can get per calorie out of any food. And so it's interesting that herbs and spices serve two really important roles. One, it minimizes palate fatigue, but two, they're also very, very nutrient dense. So they end up ticking two boxes simultaneously. Fourth component of cuisine is that we have rules governing eating. This includes the number and time of day when meals are eaten, whether they're eaten alone or with others, the setting of meals, ceremonial use of foods, etc. We now eat everywhere and all the time, and really the only taboo that we face while eating is orthorexia. It's eating well. Nobody gets made fun of when they show up at work and they have a big gulp and a bag of potato chips. The people that get teased are folks that have, bacon salad with salmon and some avocado on it, and you are orthorexic for eating that way. So the only food taboo that we really have in our culture now is good eating, and that's just fascinating. So a couple of examples from some modern foragers. The Kung foragers living in the Kalahari Desert typically consumed about 105 species of plants, they live amongst 105 species of plants and animals. About 500 of these species have been identified as edible, but interestingly, it's over on the other one, they only use a small number of these options typically. And these options tend to be the most nutrient dense, but also the most flavorful foods they have. But this again goes back to this idea, it's not just that we do have food available. Our ancestors have always had food available. They would walk over food to get to food that was more tasty. So again, there's this dynamic equilibrium going on between getting the easiest to get stuff versus also knowing that there might be some tastier stuff a little further away that we want to get to. So I'm trying to pin down this idea in my own head of this idea that we want enough variety to keep excited about the things that we're eating, but not so much variety that it kicks us over into what would potentially be pathological eating. The Aceh Indians, again from the same paper, and I'll share this paper with you guys at the end, the Aceh Indians only exploit about 50 of the 200 plant and animal species available to them. So it's interesting, they have lots of food options, but they only go after some very specific individual choices in their area. So a great piece from the paper, neglected area, the Paleolithic diet is the ingestion of commensal bacteria that are important in upregulating the immune system. The hygiene hypothesis claims that the lack of childhood exposure to infections, pathogens, parasites, symbiotic microorganisms et cetera, increases the susceptibility to allergy and autoimmunity. I think everybody's super familiar with this, but it was just fascinating that this paper wove this into the story. A great part to this is that one of the researchers speculates that the difference between Western and Paleolithic diet, the Paleolithic diet contained at least 1 billion times more non-pathogenic bacteria than our modern diet does. That's just stunning. And I'm sure that folks have seen some talks or maybe seen some articles where we understand that changes in our microbiome can dramatically change the way that we absorb nutrients. We could have an individual that is lean and has what we would call a healthy microbiome, and that person then receives a microbiome transplant from an individual that is unhealthy and possibly overweight, and then the healthy individual becomes unhealthy. So not only have we decreased the volume of our bacterial load, but we've clearly decreased the types of foods that would generally provide substrate for these bacteria to grow on. So the industrial processed fast foods that are designed to be eaten anywhere are attractive, durable, accessible, convenient, ready to eat, ready to heat. They are designed to be extremely palatable and can be habit forming. Anybody disagree with that? Yeah, I mean, this is the problem that we face. This is the modern food story. Ultra-processing can introduce tremendous variety into the diet. Differences in shape and flavor are distinct enough to give the eater a sense of variety that obscures the nutritional sameness. The abundant variety at a meal bypasses the brain's sensory-specific satiety, thus overriding palate fatigue. So our modern way of eating is set up in such a way that the normal, we want variety, we want something new, but we're also supposed to reach a satiety point and then move on. But what we're able to do is move on and move on and move on and continue eating food in a way that has become pretty deleterious to our health. In a world of plenty, a varied diet may be maladaptive by stimulating appetite-promoting excessive eating. Even the way Americans organize their meals by courses that are distinctively different maximizes food intake by overcoming the consumption-limiting effects of sensory-specific satiety. The variety produces the dessert effect, in which the satiated eater will rekindle their appetite when presented dessert, which is so different from the meal of foods, making them more palatable. So the way that we eat today, we eat the way that professional eaters eat. And I'll show you an example of that. This is pretty cool.
Fueled by San Francisco's energy and support, I'm feeling fine. But then, the magnitude of what I am eating hits me.
Wow. This is crazy.
I am experiencing sweetness overload.
In the words of William Shakespeare, this totally sucks.
Frantic to stop the sugary tide from rising, I make a desperate play.
Can I get like a small plate of fries, something salty to break it up?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Right now, all the orange is starting to get to me. I think the more I can appreciate each bite, I got a better chance of rocking this one.
I cautiously eat a few fries. The strategy works, for now, and I resume my epic ice cream battle.
What do you guys think of that? So this guy, Adam, I forget his last name, Man vs. Food, ice cream challenge was eat 10 pounds of ice cream in like 30 minutes or something like that. Might have been an hour, I forget exactly what it was. And the guy's motoring through, eating ice cream, eating ice cream, eating ice cream, and then he hits this wall, palate fatigue. So clearly ice cream is tasty stuff, right? But even ice cream becomes problematic at some point. Now, do you think his belly was pretty full with, so he plateaued out at like 6.5, 7 pounds of ice cream. Do you think distension-wise his belly was pretty full? Yeah, I mean, it's pretty damn full by that point. How does he get over the hump with this process? How does he stay in the game and finish his ice cream? Variety, but it's actually more food. He stuck more food down his pie hole than what he needed to if he just was able to finish that thing. But I looked at website after website of professional eaters, and they all have very detailed recommendations. If you have a salty, pungent thing, then you should have a sweet interlude at this caloric intake and this timing. They've really broken it down to a science as to how you can be a very effective professional eater. And it was fascinating. It looked like if the portion sizes weren't so large, it's like, that would be a pretty nice meal. There's a lot of variety in that, you know? So, you know, where we're at is we have good genes, but really bad options. We're in a situation where, we face a lot of challenges given the food environment that we live in. Food choice in humans is affected by hardwiring for certain tastes. Americans consume a vast amount of sugar, upwards of 6,000 pounds over the course of a lifetime. And I know there's a lot of people, Mark Sisson made the point that, we shouldn't freak out over a teaspoon of sugar. That's absolutely true. But we definitely eat too much sugar. And sugar definitely gets incorporated into a lot of the foods then it heightens the palatability and it leads into the consumption of more food. The co-evolution of genes and taste perceptions illustrates the ways in which cultural factors impact diet. This cultural layering suggests that the nutritional failings of America cannot solely be tied to biological factors, opening an examination of another evolutionary trend that will provide a basis for our nutritional dilemma. So what does that mean? We've reached a point where our biology is just working against us, and on a very microcosmic level, we're seeing our environment change faster than what we clearly biologically are able to change. And even though culture is part of what got us in this problem to start off with, culture was slash and burn, and then agriculture, and then cities and technology and all that type of stuff. But we're at a spot now where our food environment and our environment at large has changed so rapidly that we possibly may not be able to keep a handle on that. Are we going to be able to cognitively, emotionally make the changes to be able to stay ahead of this process? And it's really interesting, and I don't know that I have a completely solid answer on it. There are two major events in evolutionary history that are at the basis of the contemporary dietary problems: the transition to primary food production, that's agriculture, and the industrialization of the food system. So agriculture clearly played an enormous role in a change in the course of humanity, and now the industrialization of food is the next one, and it will be interesting to see how or if we get past that. And I just have to throw this in there because people make light of this evolutionary perspective, and I just have to remind folks, we did not come up with this concept of Paleolithic diet. Anthropologists did. Anthropologists and archaeologists came up with this concept by looking at the skeletal remains and living amongst contemporarily living hunter-gatherers, and noticed that these people were very, very healthy. And somehow we get into this rope-a-dope where we can't use that as the justification, but yet that is kind of the justification. So it's a frustrating thing for me. But the transition from foraging to agriculture shows an array of pathologies that suggest a decline in health as populations transformed to primary food production. Shifting from hunter-gatherer to agriculturalist was good for the species, arguably, but bad for the individual. Empirically, agricultural populations experienced significant instances of nutritional deficiencies, although they were able to produce surpluses that drove cultural development. So, laboratory studies indicate that energy-dense foods and energy-dense diets have a lower satiating power and may result in passive overeating. Using that dense acellular carbohydrate paper as kind of a benchmark, and also some palatability reward stuff that Stefan Guyenet has put together, I think that we're sneaking up on some ideas that could be very helpful for folks. We've always said eat whole, unprocessed foods, but we now have both biochemical, microbiome, and biocultural, evolutionary reasons for why simple foods are really the way that we get out of this jam. So mentioned the acellular carbohydrate story. The use of ultra-processed food may have a role in the obesity epidemic that has become a global issue. Studies in animals and humans show that an increase in consumption when there is more variety in a meal or diet. So that's the man versus food deal. That's the dessert effect. So we definitely want variety. We need variety. If you get so bored, then you will cease eating the stuff that you're eating. And that's some of the problem that we face when people start eating paleo or primal or whatever it is. They get bored with the particular things that they're on, so they spin out and then they go into a complete hookers and cocaine binge, and it's hard to get them back after that. But then if the variety is too great, then they're already on the hookers and cocaine binge, and there's some middle ground there, and I think it's different from person to person, whether you're an abstainer or you can be moderate in your intake, and this is some of the stuff that I'm actually pretty excited about looking into in the future. So I know orthorexia is this kind of hot topic, particularly within the media, and again, you know, the only orthorexic activity appears to be trying to eat healthily, but orthorexia is woven into our genes again because we needed a little bit of suspicion about food, because the first person that ate an amanita mushroom died. The first person that ate a psilocybin mushroom had a really interesting 16 hours after that. So, you know, there's pluses and minuses on both sides of that. So neophobia, orthorexia is something that is kind of woven into us. And orthorexia limits palate options. Whether it's paleo or vegan or low carb or what have you, the way that people are successful with any type of nutritional approach is, to some degree, they shorten the aperture of their options. And this plays into this whole novelty and hyperpalatability story. So, you know, we need to have a little bit more dexterity in the way that we talk about this stuff. And I'm going to skip that one. I want to go to this one because I'm kind of running out of time. What does the standard dietetics model tell us? Don't exclude any food group, eat in moderation, exercise more, eat less. How does exercise more, eat less square with optimum foraging strategy? It's exactly the opposite, right? Get as much as you can, doing as little as you can. So exercise more, eat less, that's kind of ridiculous. Doesn't really work that well unless you're very, very lucky. The standard dietetics models have a little bit of everything, exclude nothing, then we're just assured of failure. And I just can't think of an example of mainstream medicine being more lost with regards to an understanding of evolutionary biology, you know, contextually for how it exists than the current dietetics model. Excluding food groups is orthorexic. No, it's not orthorexic. Some degree of neophobia or orthorexia is likely imperative, vital, fundamental to your ability to survive the modern food forest. I'm not really a sweets guy, but if you put a Lay's potato chip bag in my house, I won't eat one, I'll eat the whole bag. One will be the one bag, you know? So the idea, exercise more, eat less, works in metabolic wards, sucks ass in real life. And that's ass whether you're talking about the donkey or the back end of the donkey. So there's lots of people, there's some popular strength and conditioning, nutrition-oriented folks that will cite metabolic wards. If we all live locked up or with a low jack on our ankle to prevent where we go, then we might be able to make eat less, work out more work. But we live as free-ranging humans, at least until the government shuts us down, so it's not going to work. My money is totally on evolution in this story. If I'm betting against somebody being able to eat only one Lay's potato chip or the whole bag, I'm always going to bet against the individual having self-control, because we're not wired for self-control. We're wired to seek out novelty, and we are exposed to hyperpalatable foods that completely bypass the satiety indexes in the brain. And even if we manage to eat 7 pounds of ice cream, which bypasses the novelty index of the brain up to a point, then we can have a plate of French fries to bypass it even more. So we have a really interesting process to deal with. I mentioned earlier, I kind of skipped ahead to this slide. Novelty involves the ancient areas of the brain which largely supersede the logical forebrain in decision making. My hope is that this idea, this concept, Rationalizing this is going to be very hard to make it effective. We need some other techniques, and I actually provide some techniques and some resources here in a little bit. But really, if there was a singular goal with this talk, it's that the people in this room, the people that we coach, the people that are our clients and patients and our family members, it's that if they struggle, that they understand that they struggle for a good reason and not that they are broken. That's the fundamental idea, and I hope that somewhere in this wandering exchange that comes across. So what the heck do you do? How do you navigate this story? We recognize the Omnivores Dilemma. Eat more, move less is actually, you know, what's baked in the cake. So how do we deal with that? Tame novelty with simple foods. Lots of people have talked about this. Stefan Guillenet has talked about this. Dan Party has talked about this stuff on a very sophisticated neuroregulation of appetite level. Use the food matrix and tools like that to get enough novelty to stay within some boundaries that are healthy, but we don't get into the ice cream eating championship and need a plate of French fries to finish the meal. Avoid the professional food eating strategies. Read everything from Stefan Guillenet. Like go back to the start, read forward, start at the current, read backward. Stefan has so shaped and influenced my thinking on the neuroregulation of appetite. Lots of people study this. Stefan is one of the rare people that puts it into a format that I can really wrap my head around and make it useful. If you need some sort of a hand-holding guided program, there's two of them. The Ideal Weight Program by Stefan Guillenet and Dan Party is outstanding. The 14-4s by Chris Kresser. They're different in varying ways, but there's also tons of synergy between the two of them. So if you want a program that would help you or your clients move through this process, I would highly recommend both of those. I cannot recommend this book enough. Gretchen Rubin is absolutely amazing. I have been unimpressed, bordering on disgusted by most of the behavior change memes that exist out in the world. Gretchen's is completely action and outcome based, and she provides some really interesting triage methodology for people to figure out how they are wired so that we can understand that maybe one person abstaining 100% from food is totally appropriate for that person, and another person can have a little bit and they're okay with that, and abstinence would actually drive them over the edge, and both of those people are okay. Currently, the standard dietetics model says that the abstinence person is a disordered eater, and it's bullshit. It's dooming 50% of the population to failure. And these people should be strung up for that process. I want to wrap up here really quickly. It is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent. It is the one most adaptable to change. We need to be adaptable on a cognitive level, on a social level, to be able to get ourselves out of the jam that we are in. We need to recognize that we are wired to eat a lot of different things, to be lazy, and on some level we need to understand that that is us, that is our wiring. But the way that we step beyond that is by being adaptable, but this adaptation isn't going to occur on a genetic level, not really an epigenetic level. It's got to happen on a personal and a cultural level for us to be able to bypass this whole process. And just remember, it's not morality or stupidity or laziness. It's novelty. Thank you, guys. So I have no corneas at all. So we have like 5 minutes for questions? Okay. So if anybody has questions, if not, if you guys need to pee as bad as I do, then we could all run to the bathroom. So, no questions? Cool. Yeah. On the laparoscopic surgery stuff,
I deal a lot with bariatric surgery stuff, and I would include the cost per annum of care after bariatric surgery. You've included the $15,000 to $30,000 for the surgery. The cost per annum care is $12,000 a year for that patient, and you extrapolate that out for their lifespan. we're talking $200,000 to $300,000.
Right.
So it's a big deal. It's a huge cost.
Well, that's kind of another talk when I do my Moore's Law and evolutionary medicine one, but yeah.
Thanks, Rob. So we're troubled by all these excessive rewards for a lot of things. Do you think there's a way that we can modify how we reward ourselves or create some kind of method for generating better rewards for what is more effective? What are more effective choices now in our current environment? Like
Bacon.
social.
Bacon. I don't know. I mean, we have 50,000 food products in a supermarket. We have 11,000 new food products each year. I don't know what the exact answer is. It seems like focusing on whole unprocessed foods, cellular carbohydrate, fruits, vegetables, roots and tubers, not super processed, season them enough so that you can stick on a regimen like that, but not so much that you completely go wild and you're selling your body in the Mission District to pay for your habits. So, yeah.
I was wondering if you found how important a transition period is so that you can reawaken kind of an enjoyment of bitter stuff. I used to like chocolate, now tastes like chalk. A diet soda now tastes like a chemical soup, but I kind of had to fake it for a while until, my taste buds almost changed and reset. Your
palatability definitely, your palate changes for sure, and when you have a more simplified palate, more simplified food experience, you tend to taste more subtle nuances in that, and it definitely takes time. Probably both Stefan and Dan would have a better idea of what the timeline is on that change, and I'm sure it varies from person to person. But it is clearly a legit effect that occurs. Yeah.
Hi, Rob. My question is about fixing gut bacteria. I'm in the back toward the stairs.
Oh, gotcha.
Sorry to keep you from the bathroom.
No problem.
So there seems like there's so much awareness that gut bacteria is really a problem, especially in obesity, but it seems like there's so much noise in how to fix it. So I was curious what you have found as the best way, because it feels like there's 57 ways and who knows what to do.
I think that there are a lot of different approaches. Like if we're just dealing with small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, it may be simply removing refined carbohydrates, doing a low-carb diet for 6 weeks, reintroducing fermentable starch and prescripticus and a couple of other varieties of probiotics, and everything's fine. Other people will need to go on a course of antibiotics to prune back that small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Other people may need to do a fecal transplant. They're finding an enormous amount of success with porcine pinworms for some people. And they're infected with pig pinworms, and it creates an inflammatory response in the gut that seems to reset the immune system. So two things. My knowledge is completely inadequate in this area. It's something that I try to stay on top of, but it's an enormous field and hard to really keep track of. And the other thing is that there's huge individuality on this. And so I don't know that there's going to be a singular approach. Hopefully with time, we create a little bit of a logic tree so that we can triage people and move them through that process in a more reasonable and less random way. And I think that's it, right? We're good. Yeah. Thank you guys for coming. Thank you.